Chapter 24. "The point is this," Enzo said. "If he is so keen to stop me investigating this crime, he must believe there is something in all the old evidence that could lead to him, and he thinks I'll find it." The debris of the meal lay scattered across the long dining table. The civet de sanglier, wild boar stew, had been rich and delicious, served with steaming new potatoes and haricots verts with garlic. They had got through 3 bottles of wine, and Enzo and Roger were sipping cognacs with their coffee. Oak doors opened onto the kitchen, and French windows led onto what in summer would be a shaded terrace that looked out across the fields. An oil painting of an English hunt scene hung on the end wall. A retractable lamp had been drawn down from the ceiling so that the table was brightly illuminated, but the faces around it were half in shadow. Anna had sat at the opposite end from Enzo, and he had watched from a distance as Raffin chatted easily to her, exerting the full force of his not inconsiderable charm. He had noticed, too, how Raffin's attentions had put Kirsty's nose out of joint. He wondered what she had ever seen in him. He was a man obsessed by his own image, convinced of his own intelligence, and while he had a certain charisma, there was a sense that his charm was something he could turn off and on at will, that it was phony, a facade that failed to reflect the real Raffin, whoever that might be. Enzo certainly had no idea, and wondered if his daughter had somehow managed to find something more substantial beneath the veneer. But he doubted it, and remembered someone once saying of a shallow acquaintance, "Scratch away that surface veneer, and what do you find? More veneer." Enzo suspected that something a little more sinister lay behind the image the journalist presented to the world, something dark, as Charlotte had once said to him, something you might find lurking under a stone. For all her 28 years, Enzo feared that Kirsty's experience of life was limited, and her interpretation of it naive. He was afraid that her relationship with Raffin would only end in tears. Hers. Raffin had brought his laptop to the table. The book he had been examining earlier was his own, Assassins Cachés, Hidden Killers. He had reread the chapter on Lambert and consulted his computer notes for further detail. He eyed Enzo down the length of the table. "You're absolutely convinced it's the Lambert case?" Enzo folded his hands on the table in front of him. "It was sealed for me by what the pathologist who autopsied Odeline Pomereux said. Hélène Taillard told me he described the occipital disarticulation of the 3rd and 4th vertebrae as a real pro-job." Raffin nodded. "The same words used by the pathologist on the Lambert case." "It's too big a coincidence, Roger, and too specific a scale to be a copycat killing designed to put us off the scent. So let us assume that we are dealing with whoever killed Lambert." He unfolded his hands and waved one towards Raffin. "Maybe you should start by telling everyone the facts of the case." Raffin glanced around, the curious faces all turned in his direction, and Enzo sensed how he enjoyed the limelight. The journalist took a sip of his brandy. "Pierre Lambert was a homosexual, a rent boy operating out of an apartment in Paris. But he wasn't someone you would pick up on the street. He made his appointments by telephone. According to his friends, he kept a diary of his engagements and an address book full of phone numbers. Neither of those was ever found." He paused as he scrolled through a document on his computer. "Lambert was rumoured to have had an affair with someone high up in government, but that rumour was courant only among his friends, and derived from his own boasting that never included a name or any other details. He had been known to embroider his life with fanciful exaggerations, so no one really knows how much truth there was in it, if any. The police wasted a lot of time pursuing that line of inquiry, to no avail." An extraordinary silence had settled over the table, curiosity morphing into fascination. "He advertised his services in the classified columns of various Parisian newspapers and magazines, and while by all accounts he was never out of work, his income could never have been enough to explain the very large amounts of money being paid on a regular basis into one of his bank accounts." Nicole leaned into the light. "What kind of sums?" Raffin consulted his notes. "Various, ranging from 100,000 to 500,000 francs. It was amazing how, in only 8 years, the value of the franc had retreated into the mists of history. Everyone around the table did the calculation, turning francs into euros, but Raffin voiced it for them. That's around 15,000 to 75,000 euros. Payments were made on average every 2 months, amounting over a period of 18 months to nearly 500,000. Blackmail? Kirsty said. Raffin gave a tiny shrug. Perhaps, but there is no evidence of that. If it was blackmail, we don't know who or why. The money was always paid in cash into an offshore account on the Isle of Jersey in the Channel Isles, and it was never declared for tax purposes. He opened his book at a place he had marked earlier with a slip of paper and ran the heel of his hand between the pages, breaking the spine to keep it open. We really don't know that much more about him. I did some research into his family background, which was entirely unremarkable. He came from a working-class family in a Paris banlieue. His father died when he was very young, and he grew up in a household that consisted of his mother, his sister, and an aunt. So his role models were all women. He played with dolls and indulged in girls' games with his older sister. Make-believe games like hospitals. He was a low achiever at school and left early to train as a waiter. He worked for a couple of years at a restaurant on the left bank, which is where he met his first pimp, and discovered that there was more money to be made by exploiting his sexuality. He knew a lot of people, but didn't have many friends. From all accounts, he was not a very likable young man. He was 23 when he was murdered. He flipped through a few pages to his next marker. Now this is where it gets interesting. He looked up, a slight smile widening the corners of his mouth. He had his audience in the palm of his hand. He had just taken on the rental of a pretty expensive furnished apartment south of Chinatown in the 13th arrondissement. The apartment building was in the Rue Max Jacob. It had been recently renovated, and his apartment was one up, overlooking the Parc Kellerman. He was found murdered in his séjour by his cleaner on the morning of Thursday, February 20th, 1992. As best the pathologist could tell, he'd been dead for around 15 to 16 hours, which puts his time of death at some time the previous afternoon. Enzo said, I haven't studied the case in any great detail yet, but as I recall from my original reading of it, it was a very curious crime scene. Raffin inclined his head in acknowledgment. It was, in various respects. The murder itself, for a start. Lambert appears to have been half-strangled before his killer finally decided to break his neck, a manoeuvre performed, apparently, with well-practiced precision. A real pro-job, as the médecin légiste said. Which, Enzo interjected, makes you wonder why his killer was trying to strangle him in the first place. It seems very untidy. It wasn't the only untidy aspect of the crime scene. A coffee table had been shattered, apparently by the combined weight of the two men falling on it, so it seems there was a struggle. Bruises on Lambert's back and skull led the pathologist to conclude that the killer had been on top of him when they fell. There were coffee stains on the carpet, a broken cup and 2 broken saucers. A second was still intact. There was a smashed sugar bowl, and lumps of sugar were scattered across the floor. It appeared that the men had been drinking coffee together before the attack, leading to an assumption by the police that the victim had known his killer. That's quite an assumption to make on the basis of 2 broken coffee cups. It was Bertrand's observation that broke the flow of Raffin's narrative. Raffin raised a finger and waggled it. No, there was more. But I'll come to that in a moment. The next interesting piece, or should I say pieces of evidence, were in the kitchen. On the kitchen counter next to the sink, investigators found a small empty bottle, a brown medicine bottle which had contained pills, most of which were scattered across the kitchen floor along with its plastic cap. The pills were short-acting prescription antihistamines known as terfenadine, sold under the brand name of Seldane. Although these were prescription drugs, this was not the bottle they had come in, so there was no label. And, more curiously, no fingerprints. None at all. In the sink there was a broken glass tumbler, one of a set of 6. The remaining 5 were found in a kitchen cupboard. The only prints recovered from it were Lambert's. Now here's the thing. He looked around the rapt faces fixed upon his. Antihistamines like terfenadine were taken to counteract the effects of severe allergic reactions like hay fever or animal allergies. But Lambert had no history of allergy. None. His GP had never prescribed him an antihistamine. "So they belonged to the killer?" Sophie said. "He was having an allergic reaction?" Raffin inclined his head in such a way as to cast doubt on her theory. "Maybe, maybe not. The murder took place in February, so he couldn't have been suffering from hay fever. Lambert didn't keep cats or dogs, so it wasn't an animal allergy. There was nothing obvious in the apartment that he would have reacted to." "So why would he have spilled pills all over the place and left the bottle on the counter?" "If we knew that, Sophie, we probably wouldn't be sitting here tonight." Bertrand said, "You said there was some other reason the police thought that Lambert knew his killer." Raffin nodded. "Yes, probably the most enigmatic and tantalizing piece of evidence in the whole case. 16 years ago, people still used telephone answering machines that recorded messages on cassettes. On the cassette, on Lambert's answering machine, police found what appears to have been an accidentally recorded conversation. The machine was set to answer after 4 rings. Lambert must have picked up the receiver at the same moment the machine kicked in, unaware that it had done so. The whole conversation was recorded." He sighed. "Unfortunately, it was a very short conversation. No names were used. The caller was male and made a rendezvous to meet Lambert at his apartment at 3 o'clock the following afternoon, the day of the murder, coinciding pretty closely with the time of death estimated by the pathologist." "In other words, whoever made that phone call was the killer," Bertrand said. "That's what the police figured. The trouble is it didn't lead them anywhere. There was nothing in the conversation that gave the least clue as to the identity of the caller. The entire conversation only lasted about 40 seconds. Very frustrating. They could listen to the killer's voice, but they had no idea who he was." "Or why they were meeting?" Enzo had read the text of the call several months previously, but couldn't remember the precise nature of it. "No, just that they needed to talk." Enzo's brain was working overtime. "Remind me, there were no fingerprints recovered, were there?" "None. At least none that were of any use. Lambert's, of course, his cleaner, some partial prints that matched the previous renters. A few others of unknown origin that didn't match anything in the police database. It was pretty much assumed that the killer was wearing gloves. The lack of prints on the medicine bottle, or on the broken glass in the sink. Only Lambert's prints were recovered from the coffee cups, the saucers, the sugar bowl, and the pathologist in his report said that the shape of the finger bruising around Lambert's neck was consistent with his attacker being gloved." "Very odd," Enzo said, "that you would sit drinking coffee in someone's house with your gloves on. And then the medicine bottle, if it was his. No label, no prints." "He was being very careful," Nicole said. "So careful, in fact, that he could only have come to Lambert's apartment with one intention: to kill him. So careful that he would carry his medicine in an unmarked bottle, then careless enough to leave it lying on the kitchen counter. Which makes me think that Sophie might have been right, that he was having an allergic reaction to something and losing control, spilling the pills, breaking a glass." "A reaction to what?" Raffin said. "I don't know. We're going to have to go back over all the old evidence. Is there any way we can access that?" "Maybe. The original investigating officer is retired now, but when I spoke to him, I got the impression that it still niggled. Unfinished business. You know, one of those unresolved cases that mars an otherwise outstanding career. I think we could count on his help." Enzo thought about it. 1992. That's a long time ago. The trail will be pretty cold by now. But there must be something there, something the killer's scared of. And we shouldn't forget that he's left a more recent trail. Cast his description of the man at the press conference in Strasbourg, and at the station 2 days later. We both saw him, if just for a moment, in the taxi outside Kirst's apartment. The same man who purchased strands of my hair in Cahors. He may or may not be the killer, but at least we have a face." "Two," Nicole said, and Enzo smiled. You're quite right. We also have the phony doctor who told me I was dying of cancer. That man's face will live in my memory for a very long time. And he was good. You know, convincing. Like a professional. Like a real doctor, you mean? No, Nicole, like an actor. And if there's one thing we know about actors, they put their faces out there for hire. Someone found him to hire him. So maybe we can find him too. But first of all, I think we have to go to Paris. Kirsty seemed surprised. All of us? No, just me and Roger. The minute we step into the frame again, we become targets. He glanced at Raffin, who looked less than pleased at the prospect of making himself a target. Because I'm already pretty much convinced about one thing now. Raffin frowned. What's that? Lambert's murder wasn't some random act of revenge, or a crime passionnel. The man who killed him really was a professional. He stood outside on the terrace, leaning on the wrought iron at the top of the steps for a long time, warmed still by his anger. That this man should so cold-bloodedly have murdered a woman whose only crime was that she knew Enzo, that he had tried and only just failed to kill Kirsty, was fueling a sense of outrage and revenge the like of which Enzo had never felt before. He became aware of how tightly he was gripping the rail and forced himself to relax. The nearly full November moon had risen high over the village, and a frost was settling like dust across the fields. It seemed wrong that such a beautiful night should be spoiled by such base feelings. He took a deep breath and turned away, opening the door and stepping into the darkened hall. A night light at the far end cast a faint illumination on the spiral staircase that led up to the floor above. Everyone else had gone to bed. Anna had said nothing more to him than a cursory bonne nuit. Perhaps she was regretting allowing them to stay. And then he remembered how animated she had been with Raffin during dinner, and a seed of jealousy stirred deep inside of him. As he approached the stairs, he saw a line of light beneath doors leading to a study at the back of the house. Someone was still up. He nudged open the door, and Nicole turned from a desk pushed against the far wall, a bank of computer monitors flickering in the muted light of a desk lamp. "Oh, hi, Monsieur MacLeod. I thought everyone had gone to bed." "What are you doing, Nicole?" He shoved his hands in his pockets and walked over to the desk. "It's great, isn't it? All this computer stuff. High-speed internet, color laser printer, fax, flatbed scanner. There's 4 computers here, and about 500 gigs worth of external hard drive." "Yes, but what are you doing with it?" "Anna said it would be okay. I've plugged in my laptop, connected up to a 30-inch cinema screen. I can drag files backwards and forwards between screens backing up onto a FireWire hard drive." She paused, eyes shining. An only child, a lonely girl raised on a remote farm in the Aveyron, Nicole had found her focus and her talent in an alternative virtual world. "What did he look like?" "Who?" "The oncologist. The actor." Enzo closed his eyes and saw him as clearly as if he was right there in front of him, and he wondered if the man had the least idea of the hell he had put Enzo through. He had short, dark hair, but it was flecked through with grey, receding from the temples. I remember thinking he was a good-looking man. He had blue eyes, dark blue, like deep ocean reflecting blue sky, a square sort of face, tanned, fleshy lips. I'd say he was early 40s. Quite tall, not as tall as me, but well built. When I think about it now, he didn't seem quite comfortable in his suit and tie. I guess I probably thought his uneasiness was because of me, because of what he had to tell me. But looking back, the suit was probably not his natural habitat. If you were to cast him in a movie, he might well play a military man, or an action hero. He opened his eyes again and found Nicole staring at him. "If he can be found, Monsieur MacLeod, I'll find him." "How?" "I'll start with the internet. I already Googled acteurs in France. There are a lot of actors' agencies and directories online, and most of them carry photographs. With a description like the one you gave me, I should be able to narrow them down pretty quickly." Chapter 25. He wasn't sure how long he'd been asleep. In fact, he wasn't certain he had slept at all. He was in a large room at the front of the house with views towards the village. He'd left the shutters open, and tall windows laid elongated arches of moonlight across polished wooden floors scattered with Chinese rugs. The light kept his demons at bay, but his mind in an unsettled state that hovered indeterminately somewhere between sleep and consciousness. He had been aware of the noises of the night. The house, like all old houses, had its own characteristic sounds. Sounds that, with time, he would stop hearing. The cracking of the central heating pipes as they cooled, a deep creaking in the roof as the stone tiles contracted, applying pressure to the oak they were nailed to, the scurrying of field mice finding shelter from freezing temperatures among the rubble between thick stone walls. Outside, an owl in the trees was exchanging hoots with another somewhere across the valley. He lay on his back, trying not to think, eyes half shut, semi-focused on a crack in the ceiling, when a floorboard creaked outside his door, like the sound of a footstep in wet snow. He pulled himself up onto one elbow, wide awake now, and stared towards the door as it opened to let in a sliver of light from the hall. The shadow of a figure slipped into his room and drifted through the moonlight like a ghost, until he saw the curtain of dark hair tumbling across her shoulders as she let her dressing gown slip to the floor. A swish of silk on smooth skin. Black eyes found his in the dark. He said, "I thought." "Shh." She put a finger over his lips. "This way, no one has to be embarrassed about our sleeping arrangements, especially your girls." Something about her discretion, her concern for his daughters, touched him, and he felt a wave of affection for her. As she bent over him, he took her head in his hands and kissed her. He had meant to make love to her slowly, surely. A slow hand, a steady beat. But in the end he had consumed her quickly, devouring her almost in a single bite. Now they lay breathless from the exertion side by side, damp sheets twisted around spent bodies, cold air on burning skin. He had no idea how long they stayed like that, limbs cooling in the falling temperature of the bedroom. He was already drifting in some netherworld when he felt her lips on his face, a soft, fond kiss, and then she reached over to cover them both with the quilt. He thought he heard her whisper, "I love making love with you," an echo of Strasbourg. But he couldn't be sure. It felt as if he had been asleep for hours, but when he woke it was still pitch dark. The moon had dipped in the sky and was casting its light now on the wall above the bed. As he came to in the silence, he heard her breathing. Not the slow, steady rhythm of sleep, the shallower, more rapid beat of impatient consciousness. He was lying face down and rolled onto his side to see her lying on her back, staring wide-eyed at the ceiling. He reached out a hand to touch her face, and she turned towards him. He said, "What's wrong?" "Nothing. I can't sleep, that's all." "Why?" "Just everything. You calling out of the blue like that, arriving with your family and friends in tow, the whole incredible story. I can't stop thinking about it." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's not just you. There's other things in my head, too." "What sort of things?" "Oh, you know, the sort of things that keep me awake on other nights." "We all have our demons." "Yes, we do." She smiled, then turned away again to gaze at the ceiling. "I have no idea what yours are." "That's because I haven't told you." He looked at her profile caught in the moonlight and thought how its cold, colourless light aged her, sinking her eyes into shadow. "You haven't told me much of anything." Her mouth widened slightly, a small smile. "I'm more enigmatic that way. Keeps the mystery alive. You ski in the winter and scuba dive in the summer. You once represented your country at the Olympics. Your parents live in Strasbourg. That's about the sum total of my knowledge. So what else do you want me to tell you?" "I don't know. Is it where you grew up, Strasbourg?" She shook her head. "No, my mother comes from Strasbourg, but they only moved there when my father retired. I was brought up in Lyon." She inclined her head to find him watching her. "Is that really what you wanted to know?" You told me, that night we met, that you never expected to be 40 and alone. Does anyone? Why are you alone, Anna? You're an attractive woman. You have a lot of life still ahead of you. She turned her gaze back to the ceiling and pressed her lips together as if afraid of the words that might spill out if she opened them. She held her silence for a long time. When, finally, she spoke, it was in a very small voice, little more than a whisper. You look back on your life sometimes and wish you'd made different decisions. You know, the big decisions, career over personal life, one man over another. And then the little things that sometimes have even bigger consequences. Like deciding you don't have time to go to the shops. There's a laundry needing done and you say, go on, don't wait for me. The shops will be shut by the time I'm done here. And if you hadn't, they might still be alive. Or you might be dead with them and it wouldn't matter. Enzo saw a tear trickle from the corner of her eye and catch the light of the moon. Who? My husband? My little boy? His voice was hushed. What happened? He brushed the silver tear from her face. Road accident. You know, the sort of thing you read about all the time and never think about the pain of the ones left behind, and how it never really goes away. You can replace almost anything but people. Enzo closed his eyes and shared her pain. I know. But she was lost in her memories and missed his empathy. I was so determined not to have children until my career was over, it was too late to start again. I only married André because he got me pregnant. But I kind of loved him, in a way, because I knew he loved me. She drew a deep breath, and he heard the tremble in it. But none of that matters now. Can't go back. Can't undo it. Any of it. You're not too old to still have children. Physically, maybe. But in my head that time came and went. She turned her head towards him and forced a smile. Anyway, I bet you're wishing you'd never asked. Enigma's more interesting than tragedy. He laid his hand on her cheek. I'm sorry, Anna. Oh, God, can we change the subject? Or neither of us will get any sleep tonight. Sure. What do you want to talk about? I don't know. She rolled her eyes in an extravagant show of thinking about it. How'd you get in tow with that creep Raffin? Which took Enzo by surprise. You don't like him? No, I don't. You seem to be getting on very well with him over dinner. I was being polite. He's such a phony, and I'm way too long in the tooth to fall for that crap. What on earth does Kirsty see in him? Her words echoed almost exactly his own earlier thought. I wish I knew. At least you're taking him away with you to Paris. She thought for a moment. When do you plan to go? First thing tomorrow. She raised herself on one elbow and looked at him, half of her face caught in full moonshine, the other in deep shadow. You're kidding. You only just got here. My life's on hold, Anna, until I deal with this. When someone is trying to destroy everything that is dear to you, the only way to stop him is by getting him before he gets you. She looked at him pensively. I thought I'd have more time with you. When will you be back? I don't know. She slipped a cool hand beneath the quilt to find the soft warmth between his legs, and he felt himself respond immediately to her touch. Then maybe we'd better just do this again. Give ourselves something to remember until the next time. And this time, he knew, he would make love to her the way he had meant to before, with a long, slow burn to warm the cold night. Part 3. Chapter 26. You wouldn't normally expect to find customers sitting out at pavement tables on a cold November day in Paris, even under the protective cover of an awning. But since the smoking ban had come into force earlier in the year, die-hard tobacco addicts had taken to sitting out on the sidewalks, nursing their noisettes and puffing on their Gauloise, huddled over tables in coats and hats. France was changing. The stereotypical chain-smoking Frenchman was a dying breed. Literally. Enzo and Raffin found the retired commissaire, Jean-Marie Martineau, at his habitual pavement seat outside the Café More in the Rue Lafayette, not far from the Gare de l'Est. A hand-rolled cigarette smouldered in the corner of his mouth. A glass of red wine stood on the table beside him, and his face was buried in an early edition of François. This stereotypical old Frenchman at least was still alive and kicking. He drew his nose out of the newspaper as they pulled up chairs to join him.
"Ah, Monsieur Raffin."
He held out his hand.
"Comment allez-vous?"
"I'm well, Monsieur Martineau. This is the gentleman I spoke to you about on the phone, Monsieur MacLeod." Martineau extended his hand to Enzo.
"Delighted, monsieur. Your reputation goes before you."
"Would that be the good one, or the bad one?" The retired policeman chuckled. Then his smile faded.
"So, you think you're going to crack the Lambert case?"
"Only with your help."
"I spent 10 years sweating it before I finally gave up. Hate to admit defeat, monsieur, but la retraite was beckoning, and it was time for me to call it a day."
He took a final puff on his cigarette and stubbed it out in the cendrier.
"Still niggles, though."
And as the smoke leaked from the corners of his mouth, he drained his glass.
"You can buy me another, if you like."
He had a full head of white hair dragged back from a high forehead and unusually blue eyes. He was a big man, shrunken by age, a hard man in his day, Enzo guessed, tough, physical, and yet there was a gentle quality about him, a reflection perhaps of something more cerebral. A sense of humanity that had, against all the odds, survived a lifetime as a cop. He wore a heavy, dark blue overcoat, buttoned up almost to the neck, and there was a wide-brimmed felt hat on the seat beside him. Enzo noticed that he wore different patterned socks, and that his shoes had long since lost their shine. There were food stains on the front of his coat, and it occurred to Enzo that Jean-Marie Martineau was either a widower or a confirmed bachelor. Either way, he was certain that the old policeman lived on his own. Enzo settled in his seat and glanced a little anxiously along the sidewalk. He knew there was no way the killer could know where he was, but he felt exposed here on the streets of Paris, vulnerable. Raffin ordered 3 glasses of wine and raised his voice above the roar of the traffic. "So do you think you can help?"
"Of course. What else have I got to do with my time? I've got so much of the damned stuff I can't give it away. People say it passes more quickly when you get older. But since Paulette died, every day feels like a year, and the nights even longer, especially when you can't sleep. Santé."
He raised his glass and took a sip of wine.
"Besides, I'd like to see you get the bastard. He still haunts me, you know, poor little Pierre Lambert. It's funny. I spent 20 years working homicide, and I always felt a kind of responsibility for the victims, like I was the only one who could represent their interests in the world they had just departed. They had no voice in it, no way of seeking justice. That was my job, and if I failed, I felt I'd let them down."
He took out a plastic tobacco pouch and a pack of Rizzler cigarette papers and began rolling a fresh smoke.
"He'd have been 40 this year. Maybe that's why time drags. I've got all his lost years to live out, too, along with all the others."
He shook his head, pulling pinches of tobacco from each end of his cigarette.
"There were a few, sadly."
Enzo lifted his glass and took a sip. The wine was cold and bitter on the tongue. Cheap red wine, la piquette, as the French called it. "So why does Lambert haunt you more than the others?"
"I suppose it wasn't him so much as his mother."
Martineau looked from one to the other.
"It's always the hardest bit. Talking to the loved ones, breaking the news. She was a poor soul, widowed when she was just a young woman, left to bring up 2 children with only her sister-in-law to help. Worked her whole life with nothing to show for it at the end. Her sister-in-law found herself a man finally and left. Her daughter got MS and ended up in a wheelchair. And then I arrive, a messenger from hell to tell her that her son's been murdered. Her boy, the only one in the whole world who cared. And since she'd had to give up her job to look after her daughter, he was her only means of support. Lambert was keeping them both, his mother and his sister. He told them he was going to move them into a nice apartment in town. It's a pity he didn't do it before he died, because the authorities couldn't have taken it away from them. As it was, his family didn't get a penny from his offshore account. That was sequestered for the case. Money of dubious origin.
Enzo said, "Did she know where his money came from?" Martineau smiled sadly and shook his head.
Didn't have a clue. She thought her precious boy had a share in a successful restaurant. She had no idea that he was gay, never mind a male prostitute. In a way, perhaps it was better for her that the case never did come to court. She would have learned things about her boy she would never have wanted to hear. And I certainly wasn't going to tell her.
Did you come to any conclusions at all about who might have murdered him, or why? The old man shook his head.
No, there was precious little evidence, and what there was proved frustratingly contradictory. I've thought about it a lot since, though. And I suppose if I was willing to make a guess, I'd probably say that Lambert had been blackmailing someone and pushed them too far. But whoever he was blackmailing, I don't think that was who killed him.
Why not?
It was a messy crime scene, monsieur, and for that I have no explanation. But Lambert's killer came prepared, left no prints, and killed him in a way you or I wouldn't know how to. My best guess would be that he was killed by a professional, someone paid to do it.
Enzo and Raffin exchanged glances.
But the best-laid schemes of mice and men gang after Glay, as your countryman once wrote, and something went wrong that afternoon. None of it went quite as planned.
He looked at Enzo.
I checked you out, monsieur, after Raffin called. You know your stuff.
Enzo inclined his head in acknowledgment. Crime scene analysis used to be my specialty.
Then maybe you can throw some light on what it was that went wrong for our killer. And if you can, then maybe we'll have a key to unlock the case.
Enzo said, "Obviously the crime scene is long gone, but I take it the police still have the evidence."
Locked up safe and sound in the clef.
Martineau looked at his watch and realized he hadn't lit his cigarette. He leaned over a burning match, and smoke rose in wreaths around his head. He looked up.
I still have some influence. The kid is orfèvre. In half an hour you'll get to see everything we had.
He finished his wine.
Which gives us just enough time for another glass.
Chapter 27. The Palais de Justice lay at the west end of the Ile de la Cité, between the Quai des Orfèvres and the Quai de l'Horloge. Le Greffe, the evidence depository, was situated deep in its bowels. Enzo had been here once before when he found clues that led him to the missing Jacques Gaillard in a trunk full of apparently unrelated items recovered from the Paris catacombs. In a vast, high-ceilinged room, row upon row of cardboard boxes were squeezed onto metal shelves that ranged from floor to ceiling. Every box told a story of murder, rape, theft, assault, the detritus of decades of crime. Evidence that either cleared or condemned, quashed or convicted, or sometimes simply baffled. Martineau pushed open the door of a small room at the end of the main hall, and Enzo placed the box marked Production number 73982/M on a plain metal table against the far wall. The retired commissaire looked at the label and recognized his own signature. He chuckled.
It's been a while since I signed one of these.
He took off his overcoat and hat and hung them on a coat stand by the door. His shirt was buttoned up to the collar, but he wore no tie. His jacket was held closed by a single button. The other two were missing. He opened the box.
Voila!
Enzo looked into it and felt a strange, breathless sense of anticipation. This was what the killer had been trying so very hard to stop him from ever doing. People had died and lives been ruined in the process. There was something in here, Enzo knew, that would shine a light into a place which had languished in darkness for nearly 17 years. It was up to him to find the switch. One by one he lifted out all the bagged evidence from the crime scene that had been Lambert's apartment. The antihistamines, now back in their bottle, shards of glass from the tumbler smashed in the sink, the broken coffee cup and saucers, the shattered sugar bowl and lumps of sugar, the victim's clothes and underwear wrapped in brown paper, his shirt, a woolen sweater, jeans, sneakers, from all of which it was apparent that Lambert had been a slight-built man of less than average height. Enzo examined the cassette from the telephone answering machine in its Ziploc bag. "Could I have a copy made of this?" Martineau shrugged. "I don't see why not." Enzo turned back to the treasure trove of evidence. There was a box of paperwork, the original police reports, Martineau's tattered black notebook. The old cop picked it up and flipped through it with nostalgic fingers, a scrawling script written by another man in another time. Observations on life and death. Pictures of the crime scene taken by the police photographer were slipped into plastic sleeves in a clip folder. Enzo glanced through them. Coarse colour under bright lights. A dead man lying among the debris of the struggle, his head turned at an impossible angle, a look of surprise frozen on his face. Enzo was shocked by how slight he was. There was something fragile about him, an attractive young man whose life and death had been defined by his sexuality. He had a fine-featured face with full, almost sensuous lips. Dark, slightly curly hair fell untidily across his forehead. The bruises and scratching around his neck were plainly visible. His appearance was dated already. Although less than 17 years had passed, it seemed as if he had come from a different era. In 17 years, Enzo had not changed so very much. He'd had his ponytail back then, wore baggy, loose-fitting shirts, cargo pants, sneakers. Timeless, unfashionable. But Lambert reflected the fashion of his time. Today, even at the same age, he would have looked quite different. Enzo examined the chaos around the boy. The shattered coffee table, an upturned chair, an occasional table that had been sent flying, ornaments strewn across a luridly patterned carpet. That there had been quite a struggle was evident. He looked up to find Martineau, smiling at him.
"I know what you're thinking. If the killer was a professional, like we figured he might have been, how on earth was Lambert able to put up such a fight? Look at him. You could have blown him over."
Enzo nodded and reached for the autopsy report. He flipped through it until he found the pathologist's description of the neck injuries and saw why the legiste had concluded that the attacker was wearing gloves. Seam stitching along the fingertips had left a pattern on the skin. The bruising itself was messy. In a classic case of strangulation, the killer might have left 3 or 4 marks on one side of the neck from his fingers, and a single mark on the opposite side from his thumb. A good patterned injury in the shape of a hand was rare, but recently cyanocrylate fumes had been used successfully to bring out the shape of a finger or handprint, sometimes even with enough detail to collect a fingerprint from the skin. Such a technique, even had it been available, would not have helped in this case. The abrasions on the neck, Enzo figured, had been made by Lambert himself trying to prise free his attacker's grasp. He flipped through a few more pages to confirm his suspicions and found what he was looking for. The pathologist had recovered skin from beneath the victim's fingernails, his own skin, gouged from his neck in the heat of the struggle. He had, it seemed, been at least partially successful in preventing his attacker from strangling him. As Martineau had observed, that seemed odd, given Lambert's slight build. In the end, however, he had been no match for a technique that had severed his spinal cord in a single deft twist of the head.
"So, what do you think?"
Raffin's impatience was palpable, but Enzo raised a hand to quiet him. He was not going to be rushed. He lifted the plastic bag containing the pills and looked at the label on it. 21 comprimés, terfenadine, brand name Seldane. He turned to Martineau.
"You're certain that Lambert did not suffer from allergies?" "As certain as I can be. His mother knew nothing about it if he did. He had never been prescribed antihistamines, and there were no others in the house."
"But terfenadine was a prescription drug."
"Yes. We always figured they belonged to the killer."
although you found nothing in the apartment that might have triggered an allergic reaction.
Our best advice at the time was that almost anything can trigger a reaction in sufferers, even someone's aftershave. But Lambert wasn't wearing any, and there was nothing else that suggested itself to us.
So why was there a broken glass in the sink and pills spilled all over the kitchen floor? Martineau shrugged.
We could only guess at that, monsieur.
Enzo picked up the crime scene photographs again, this time examining as much of the room as he could see beyond the immediate area of the struggle. A large settee and 2 armchairs that looked as if they had seen better days, half hidden beneath colourful woven throws. The lurid, thick-piled carpet, plush velvet curtains hanging in oriel windows. This was a furnished rental, right?
Right.
He hadn't been there very long.
A couple of months.
Did you talk to the previous locataire? Martineau picked up and riffled through the reports.
Yeah. Here we are. 2 days after the murder, a middle-aged couple. They'd moved across town. 14th arrondissement. It was just routine stuff. They couldn't help.
Would we be able to find them again?
Who knows? 16 years. They could have moved again. They might be dead. Why?
We need to know if they kept pets.
Pets?
Martineau frowned and scratched his head.
You know, now that you mention it, I can actually remember going to their place. Sticks in my mind only because they had these 2 thundering great Irish setters that just about knocked me over. Huge beasts. Made a big apartment seem small.
Enzo let his eyes wander over the crime scene photographs once more. Then that's probably what did it.
Did what?
Raffin said. Sparked the reaction. Martineau said,
But there hadn't been dogs in Lambert's apartment for over 2 months.
Enzo shook his head. Doesn't matter. Both cats and dogs shed something called dander. The word has the same origin as dandruff. It's a natural phenomenon in hairy animals. The outer layer of skin, the epidermis, is quite thin in dogs. It's constantly renewing itself as layers of new cells push up to replace the old ones above. The process takes place every 21 days or so. The outer cells flake off into the environment as dander. People think it's the animal's hair that causes allergy. It's not. It's the dander. Raffin said, Are you saying the killer had an allergic reaction to dogs that weren't even there? Well, consider this. Epidermal turnover is more rapid in breeds that are prone to various forms of dry and oily seborrhea. Breeds like Cocker or Springer Spaniels. He paused. Or Irish setters. These dogs shed old skin every 3 or 4 days. So the previous occupants of Lambert's apartment had dogs that were producing up to 7 times the amount of dander most dogs produce. And there were 2 of them. That dander would have permeated the entire place, sparking possible allergic reaction in a sufferer even months after the dogs had gone. He handed the folder of photographs to Martineau. Look at the place. Soft furniture, plush curtains, thick piled carpet, the worst repository of all for dander. It would be my guess, monsieur, that the killer had a severe allergy to dog dander. He maybe knew that his victim didn't keep pets, so he went unsuspecting to an apartment that was just laden with the stuff. Symptoms would have started within minutes. Judging by the struggle, the ineffectual attempt to strangle his victim, the killer was probably under serious stress, semi-incapacitated. Severe allergic reaction develops very fast. If it reaches anything like anaphylaxis, whole-body reaction, it can be disabling, sometimes even fatal. He picked up the plastic bag with the pills. The terfenadine wouldn't have been particularly effective. He must have tried to get as many into himself as he could. But the best way of dealing with a reaction like that is getting away from the source of the allergen as quickly as possible, which would have explained his panic in getting out of the place, and why he left a trail of evidence in his wake. It's even possible he might have required hospital treatment.
Jesus!
Martineau's oath slipped out in a breath. He had a very vivid picture now of a scene he had been trying to piece together for almost 2 decades. Raffin said, So he had an allergic reaction. How does that help us? Enzo turned to him. If Monsieur Martineau can get us a woods lamp, I'll show you. Martineau cocked an eyebrow.
With all due respect, monsieur, What the hell's a Woods lamp?
It's a lamp that gives off an ultraviolet light. Standard kit for a forensic scientist. But any ultraviolet lamp will do. It took Martineau more than an hour to procure an ultraviolet lamp and return to meet up with Enzo and Raffin once more at the Greffe.
"I don't know if it's a Woods lamp," he said, "but it gives off ultraviolet light."
It was around 9 inches long and 3 inches wide in a black casing, most of which was to contain a battery to power the tubular bulb. "It'll do perfectly." Enzo handed it back to Martineau and removed Lambert's patterned blue and red woolen crew-neck sweater from its paper parcel, spreading it carefully on the tabletop. "Ultraviolet," he said, "otherwise known as Blacklight, or Blacklight Blue in the trade, to distinguish it from those bug-zapping lamps. It was delivered as a light source in a lamp more than a century ago by a man called Robert W. Wood, first used in the diagnosis of infective and pigmentary dermatoses, but more recently as a diagnostic tool for certain skin cancers." He took back the lamp from Martineau. "Most often employed in forensic science to detect the presence of semen on the skin and clothing of rape victims." He turned to Raffin. "Would you turn out the light, please, Roger?" The windowless room was plunged into absolute darkness. Enzo took a deep breath. He was about to shine a light into the past. A black light, to illuminate a brutal killer. He pressed a switch, and the lamp flickered several times before casting its eerie light around the room. He held it 6 inches above the fabric of Lambert's sweater and made a slow pass over it. All 3 men could see quite clearly the glow of fluorescent silver across the chest and neck, woven into the yarn, it seemed, in random patches and trails. Enzo said, "You can turn on the light now." They all blinked in the sudden glare of harsh electric light, and Enzo turned off the ultraviolet. "What the hell is that silver stuff?" Raffin said. "Dried mucus, saliva, phlegm, invisible to the naked eye, and the pathologist would never have thought to pass a Woods lamp over the victim's clothes." Enzo turned to Martineau. "This man came to Lambert's apartment to murder him, but as you surmised, his plan went all agley. He succumbed to a severe allergic reaction brought on by dog dander from the apartment's previous renters. His immune system went haywire, responding to the dander by producing vast quantities of immunoglobulin E, known as Ig-E. The Ig-E would have gathered very quickly on the mast cells lining his nose, throat, lungs, and gastrointestinal tract. The union of the Ig-E and the allergen would have been explosive, releasing a torrent of irritating chemicals, primarily histamine. The man would have been coughing and sneezing and choking as his throat closed up, his body using nose, mouth, and eyes to try to expel the histamine like an aerosol. Even as he fought to see and murder his victim through streaming eyes, he must have been spraying him with mucus and saliva. Clear, wet liquid that would have dried to invisibility in minutes." Enzo turned back to the sweater. "It couldn't be seen, but it was there, expelled at great velocity and almost certainly rich in white blood cells, particularly the eosinophils involved in allergic reactions. Even better, there may be a stray sloughed nose hair or two, along with respiratory epithelial cells, which means there's a better than even chance we'll be able to recover DNA."
"Even after all this time?"
Raffin said. "It would have been more certain had the clothes been refrigerated, but it's relatively cool down here in the Greffe. A steady temperature. I think the chances are good." Martineau whistled softly in admiration.
"Man, I wish you'd been around 16 years ago."
But Enzo shook his head. "Wouldn't have made any difference, monsieur. Back then, we might have found the cells on his clothing, but we'd never have been able to extract the DNA." He turned to Raffin. "I think our man knew that. I think he knew that if we revisited this crime, we were almost certain to find those cells and recover his DNA. And he could only be afraid of that for one reason. His DNA is in a database somewhere." Even as he spoke the words, Enzo felt their effect. He shivered, as if someone had stepped on his grave. He had taken a huge stride towards the possible identification of his nemesis. It could only be a matter of time before the killer would know that and try to stop him from going any further. Any way he could. The stakes had just been ratcheted up to breaking point, and it seemed there was no way Enzo could avoid going head-to-head with him. Chapter 28. Cadaqués, Spain, September 1986. Outside the church, on the slate-paved terrace, 2 Mediterranean conifers offered a pool of shade, a momentary escape from the dusty blast of the sun. Below, across the Roman tiled roofs, boats bobbed gently at the moorings in a bay like glass. The reflection of sunlight on whitewash was blinding. Richard hesitated in the shadow of the trees. He felt strangely choked. He had watched her leave the house just minutes earlier, a woman of 50 whom the years had not treated kindly. One lustrous blonde hair now gone grey, pulled back severely from a thin face, pinched and turned mean by time and disappointment. A woman who passed him on the steps without a second glance. His mother. He was not quite sure why he had come. Curiosity, he supposed, a need to connect with his past. A tiny Spanish fishing port from where he had been snatched 16 years and 2 months ago. A place which had become a prison for the woman who had loved him then. And if she still did, it wasn't really him she loved. It was the memory of the child she had lost all those years before. There was something shocking in seeing her, in knowing that she was going to church to pray for him. He had stood on the steps, caught by surprise, and if she had met his eye he might have said, "Hello, Mother," and released her from her misery. Instead he had frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, and she had passed preoccupied within a few inches of her missing boy. Now that he was there, he didn't know quite what to do, but the cool of the Església de Santa Maria drew him like an inhalation of breath, an escape from the furnace, and he walked in through an opening in the tall, studded door, only to see a reflection of himself in glass behind wrought-iron gates, dark glasses and baseball cap, shorts and a T-shirt. Not exactly the respectful attire expected of those who came to worship. He turned into the church and removed his cap and shades, blinking in the dark as his eyes adjusted to the change of light, and then, suddenly, the apse at the far end of the nave was bathed in soft yellow as a tourist dropped a coin in a meter, and an altar of extraordinary extravagance, fashioned from pure gold, rose up into the vaulted dome. Angels and cherubs adorning columns and arches rising in tiers to a winged figure in flight, almost at the confluence of the dome's ribs. For a moment Richard gazed at it in awe. He had never seen anything quite like it, at least not on this scale. Then his eyes drifted among the rows of pews, searching for his mother. But she wasn't to be seen. He walked carefully through the echoing vastness, almost afraid to breathe, until he saw a red net curtain hung in the entrance to the transversal chapel. A sign in the doorway read, "A Place of Prayer," and through the curtain he could see a more modest altar, presided over by a figure of Christ washed in sunlight from windows high up in the walls. A solitary soul knelt before it in silhouette. Angela Bright was quite still, head bowed, her hands clasped in front of her. Richard stood watching her for some minutes, safe in the knowledge that even if she rose unexpectedly, he would not be immediately visible to her. If she was praying for his return, then her prayers had been answered. But he had already decided that she would never know it. He retreated to the back of the church to sit beneath the huge circle of stained glass and stare at the altar until the time purchased by the coin expired, and it retreated suddenly into its habitual obscurity. He was backlit through the glass at the door, a silhouette, like his mother, cut in sharp contrast against the rectangular halo of sunlight beyond. When she emerged, finally, from her chapel, she walked past him without even looking. She had an odd, shuffling gait, like an old woman. He rose and followed her out, slipping on his dark glasses and pulling the peak of his cap down to shadow his face. She turned into the narrow, slate-cobbled street below the church that led to her house, a whitewashed 3-story building with rust-red shutters and arched brick lintels. He wondered what she did all day in this rambling old house with its walled garden, bougainvillea, climbing the whitewash and weeping its purple tears. Did his brother and sister still live here too? He looked up and saw patterned ceramic tiles beneath the eaves. Who paid for it all? His father? His mother pushed open a mahogany-red door and was swallowed by darkness. Richard stood staring after her for some minutes. The street descended at an acute angle below him into the old town, narrow and shaded by tall houses and more bougainvillea. A few paces down on the other side of the street was a small restaurant, a chalkboard sign outside with the menu of the day. Just a handful of pesetas would get him lunch and a carafe of wine. He was served by an attractive young waitress who clearly found him interesting. She hovered attentively at his table, happy to talk. She had just left school to work in the family business, and after a busy season things were quieter now, she said. Her French was good, and her English passable. He ordered gazpacho, which came with soft chunks of rough Spanish bread, and then catch of the day, which was dorado, or sea bream, soft white flesh, moist and delicious, reminding him of home. Although now that he knew who he was, it no longer felt like a place he could call home. It was where he had grown up, with a stranger pretending to be his mother. He asked if there were a lot of foreigners buying property in the town these days, and she told him there were more and more. There was an old English lady living across the street. She'd been there for years, Senora Bright, and she was no holiday-maker. Hers was a sad story. "Oh?" Richard gave her his most charming smile. "Tell me." She glanced back towards the kitchen before running an eye over the other tables and decided she had time. She told him about the abduction of Senora Bright's child, although she was too young to remember it herself. The old lady had lived opposite ever since she could remember. She'd had 2 children with her, but she hardly knew them. Her parents had sent her to a convent school, so she didn't know a lot of the other kids in town, but she'd seen them occasionally in the street. She looked at Richard. "The boy looked a little like you." She tried to picture him without the baseball cap and sunglasses. "But he had much longer hair." Richard said, "You speak about them as if they weren't around anymore." "They're not. They went back to England a couple of years ago. To live with their father, my mother said. And good riddance. She doesn't like the English." Richard lingered over his meal, smoking several cigarettes, thinking about what he was going to do with the rest of his life, who he was going to be. After all, he was free now to be whoever he wanted. But his money wasn't going to last forever, and that was a problem. Through the open door of the restaurant he saw his mother passing, dressed all in black like a widow in mourning. He paid up quickly and said a hurried farewell to the disappointed waitress. Emboldened by a half-litre of rough red Rioja, he set off after the old lady. She was carrying a woven shopping basket and had a black headscarf tied loosely around her hair. He followed her recklessly close all the way down through the town, past the Carretera del Dr. Callis and a tiny art gallery on the corner, to the Casa de la Villa at the bottom of the hill. He leaned on the rail and looked down into the clear green water of the bay below and watched his mother climb stiffly down the steps to the curve of the harbour road. He wondered again what point there was in this. Perhaps he was simply delaying the moment when he would have to decide what to do next, but still he felt strangely compelled to go after her. Past the café-bar in the casino, she turned off the Place Frederic Rahola into the main street opposite the town's long shingle beach and climbed steps into a small supermarket. Richard lingered for several minutes out on the sidewalk before following her in. He hovered, pretending to look at the wine, as she chose a selection of fresh vegetables from tiered racks, then felt his heart seize suddenly solid as she turned in his direction. She too wore dark glasses, so he couldn't see her eyes, but she stopped, for all the world as if time had simply decided to stand still. She was looking right at him, right through him. What were maybe only a few seconds seemed to stretch into eternity. But he felt naked, bathed in the spotlight of her confusion and uncertainty, and he turned and hurried from the shop without looking back. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he felt sure that people in the street could hear it above the noise of the traffic. He daren't stop. He kept on walking until he knew there was no way she could still see him. Then he pressed himself against a wall and tried to control his breathing. He had been foolish, careless, and wondered if she had realized, if there was any way she could have recognized him. And, of course, he knew that there was. It was time to go, time to get on with the rest of his life, and it had occurred to him now exactly where to start. Chapter 29. Returning to Miramont, tucked away in its mountain valley high up in the Cantal, was an anticlimax after Paris. Enzo was not quite certain why Raffin had opted to come with him, but suspected that the journalist was being drawn back by an interest in Anna. There was no doubt that she was an attractive woman, and Raffin had so clearly been fascinated by her that first night. Enzo was uncomfortable with the thought, but had no evidence with which to back it up, and so he held his peace. When they got there, it seemed colder than before, although the sky, if anything, was a clearer, deeper blue. The winter sun cut the sharpest of shadows among the folds of the hills that rose up around the house, and the frost stayed white all day in those shaded places that the sunlight never reached. Enzo had spent a restless few days at Raffin's apartment in the Rue Tournon, just a stone's throw away from the Sena and the wide-open spaces of the Luxembourg Gardens. The weather had been grey and misty and cold, and he had passed the time walking in the park, wading through the drifts of leaves, drinking coffee and reading the papers behind the steamed-up windows of the crowded café-restaurant near the North Gate. It was not until the fourth day that he received word from the laboratory of the Police Scientifique. Cells had been recovered from the dried mucus on Lambert's pool, and a DNA profile successfully obtained. Enzo felt a sense of triumph. They had the killer's code. All they needed now was to find a match, but that was likely to take time and to be a complex and labyrinthine process. "Why?" Nicole demanded to know on his return, and Enzo explained that it was because they had no idea what databases to search. There were 27 countries in the European Union, each with its own DNA database, and while they had all signed up the previous year to the Prüm Agreement, allowing national law enforcement agencies automatic access to the DNA and fingerprint databases of other member states, Enzo did not constitute a national law enforcement agency. "So, how are you going to get access to them?" Nicole said. "I'm not. Jean-Marie Martineau, the cop who handled the original investigation, has to persuade his former colleagues to reopen the case. Even then, they'll still have to sell the idea to the Police Nationale. And you know how quickly French bureaucracy moves, Nicole. It could be a while." "Well, if he's on anyone's database, it'll probably be ours." Enzo shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not. The French database is pretty limited. The British have got the biggest in Europe. In fact, the biggest in the world. But there's nothing to say he's on any of the European computers. There are dozens of databases around the world now. And then, of course, there are the Americans, who have the second biggest. Getting access to that will generate a blizzard of paperwork all on its own." They were in the computer room at the back of the house. Nicole had several screens up and running. Enzo ran his eyes across them. "So how's the search for the good doctor going?" She made a face. "It's not. There are loads of agencies and directories. It's hard to believe, but a lot of them don't even have photographs. Then there are all these sites with so-called actors advertising their services." She blushed. "Mostly it's about sex. You know, exotic dancers, escorts, that sort of thing. But I think you might find it easier to identify your doctor with his clothes on." Enzo smiled. "I think I'd know the face, no matter what." "Well, I've got a few for you to look at. I'm not too confident, though." In fact, she had 15 JPEGs collected in a folder. Enzo leaned over the desk as she opened them one by one. These were photographs taken by professionals, always against a neutral backdrop, faces lit to show them off to best advantage. Those with few advantages had their deficiencies masked by soft focus. A catalogue of men in their 40s, showing teeth that were too white, pulling in paunches, smiling eyes trying hard to hide an optimism long lost to failure. None of them was his doctor. Nicole grimaced an apology. "I'll keep looking." Enzo had been disappointed by the coolness with which he had been greeted by Anna. He had hoped for the same warmth with which she had sent him off. The taste and scent of her remained vivid in his recollection, but she was still being discreet in front of his daughters. Now, as he left the study, she was waiting for him at the foot of the spiral staircase and gave him a quick kiss and squeezed his hand. "I missed you," she whispered. He ran his hand up through her hair to cup the back of her head in his hand and drew her to him to kiss her back. A much longer kiss, filled with the passion aroused by her very proximity. She drew away, smiling, and wagged a finger at him. "Not in front of the children." He grinned. She took his hand. "I've got a surprise for you." And she led him into the séjour, where she had removed all the paintings from one wall to mount a large whiteboard at eye level. He had told her at some point how he liked to think visually, how at home he always worked on a whiteboard, jotting down thoughts and observations, trying to find links between them and connecting them with arrows. He looked at it in astonishment. "Where on earth did you manage to find that?" She shrugged dismissively. "A few phone calls and a menuisier from the village to install it." "But won't your friends object to you defacing their house like this?" "Oh, they won't mind." Enzo thought if it was his house he would have minded, but all he said was, "Thank you," and kissed her again to demonstrate his gratitude. "How have things been?" She tilted her head a little to one side. "Okay," but she didn't sound convincing. "Sophie's pretty restless, and Bertrand too. I think he wants to get back and sort out his gym." Enzo sighed. "I feel bad about that, but it's not safe yet. It really isn't. Anyway, they go for long walks and they lunch sometimes in the village. They're out right now." "What about Kirsty?" Anna made a face. "I think she's still in shock, Enzo. Someone tried to murder her after all, and her best friend was killed. Roger didn't call once, and she spent most of her time in her room. He's up there with her now." Enzo didn't even want to think about what they might be doing. He said, "I've got something I want everyone to listen to, but I'll leave it until after we've eaten tonight." He took her face in his hands. "Is anyone helping you with the cooking?" She let him kiss her and laughed and said, "I'm enjoying it, Enzo. It's such a long time since I had anyone to cook for but myself." He slipped the cassette into the stereo system and hit the play button. All through the meal he had watched Raffin monopolizing the conversation with Anna, flirting with her, exuding charm like oil, and he had seen Kirsty become more and more subdued. At one moment he had caught Anna's eye and felt her embarrassment, her silent plea for rescue, and he had broken up the tete-à-tete by calling her into the kitchen on some pretext. He was itching to break his silence on the subject, but didn't want to create a scene in front of Kirsty and the others, and so all his attention was focused on the tape. Intent faces around the room strained to listen. Two voices distorted by time and telephone. A murderer speaking to his victim the day before he killed him. "Yes, hello?" "Salud, it's me." "Oh, okay." "I'm sorry I didn't call yesterday. I was out of the country. Portsmouth, in England, a business trip." "Is that supposed to mean something to me?" "I just thought you'd wonder why I hadn't called." "Well, you're calling me now." "I was going to suggest tomorrow afternoon. 3 o'clock, if that's okay with you." "Where?" "Your place." "I prefer somewhere public. You know that." "Listen, we need to talk." An audible sigh. "You know where to find me?" "Of course." 3 o'clock, then?" "Fine."